environmental perspective, but it actually has a huge bunch of human rights violations associated with it. We often think about rainforest burning, icebergs melting, and the poor polar bears. I'm not saying they aren't important, because they definitely are. But we need to think thoroughly about how climate change is going to affect us humans. Make no mistake, this crisis was made worse by us, by our emissions and by our impact on the climate. First and foremost is Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the right to life. Climate change will affect that. Both directly and indirectly, climate change will actually threaten our lives. The World Health Organization predicts that climate change will cause 250,000 deaths per year between 2030 and 2050. This is due to malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and heat stress. We also have the right to health. Mentally, a lot of people, especially young people, are getting mental health illnesses such as depression due to anxiety of what their future will look like. A key example being Greta Thunberg. Those forced to migrate may face post-traumatic stress disorder, and these are only a few examples. Physically, intense heat, rising sea level, and food insecurity will allow the spread of disease more easily and result in further injuries, poorer health, and deaths. We also have the right to food. This will be under strain as land becomes infertile and temperatures bake the soils. People will have to choose between starving and leaving their homes. Water and sanitation. Extreme weather will damage resources to clean water, contaminating many sources. Millions already lack clean water, and this will only increase with the climate crisis. Housing or adequate standard of living. The extreme weather will damage and destroy buildings, houses, and accommodation, displacing people. Sea level rise will also make people move due to flooding. These examples clearly point out how climate change is a human rights issue, and these are all direct impacts. Less directly, you have the right to education. If schools are damaged during tropical storms, how can children learn? If children are being forced to strike from school because their governments are too blind to take action, how are children going to learn? On top of this, children, the elderly, and marginalised communities are most at risk. People who don't contribute much to climate change and therefore have a low carbon footprint are most likely affected by climate change. They're vulnerable, most likely reasonably poor, and live in low-lying areas. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, climate change will have the greatest impact on those living in poverty. Climate change will not only affect people in poverty, it will also push more than 120 million more people into poverty by 2030. Yes, that's 11 years from now. And the World Bank reports that 143 million people may soon become climate migrants. A climate migrant is someone who is forced to flee due to sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment related to at least one of the three impacts in climate change: sea level rise, extreme weather events, and drought or water scarcity. Beira in Mozambique is reportedly the hardest hit city from the cyclone that hit in March this year. It went down as the first city to be completely devastated by climate change. Many hundreds died in what the UN called the worst weather disaster due to climate change in history in the Southern Hemisphere. 1 month after this cyclone, another hit. Entire villages were wiped out, and this left the country with violent, devastating floods. In Mozambique alone, the official death toll was over 600 people. 1.85 million were in need of humanitarian assistance, 224,000 houses were destroyed or damaged, and at least 161,000 were displaced. Climate change is the result of human beings. It's not an accident of nature. It's the direct result of policies and practices from the public and private sector. It's provoked by humans. States and governments have not responded, let alone with the necessary speed and urgency like they should have. Without further action, climate change will continue to devastate people and the planet, and human rights will continue to be violated. So, we must look for climate justice. This is the fulfillment of human rights in the face of climate change. It's the process of addressing the climate crisis as a human rights crisis and using the court of law to hold corporations and governments to account. So I'd like to end with the fact that we need urgent action right now, because at the end of the day, the climate breakdown threatens our realisation of our fundamental human rights.